So this is the fourth of 5 webinars and discussions on issues arising from the book Scotland After the Virus. And the other 3 are available online, as will this one be after tonight. I'm Simon Barrow. I'm co-editor of the book, along with Jerry Hassan, who you'll meet shortly. And Scotland After the Virus is actually our 3rd co-production with Luath Press, our host for this evening. And a 4th on the challenges of independence will be appearing later in the year. So Jerry and I working together is getting to be a habit, but hopefully a good one. Our thanks as ever to Lauren and Gavin and all our colleagues at Luath Press who are offering a special discount, I should say, on the book for this evening. You can get £2.99 off the usual cover price with this event only, and the code to use on the Luath website is SATV Social. SATV Social. You'll be reminded about that later, and you'll also get an email to remind you. And that's also, I should say, as hashtag SATV Social, the hashtag to use on social media tonight, should you be wanting to comment as we go along or see what others are saying. And a reminder also, which I'll repeat a few times, to leave your comments and questions in the chat box on the right-hand side of your screen. And after we've heard from the panel, I'll use those to pick up things that you want to say for the Q&A session. And I'll invite some people to put their questions in person by unmuting themselves. I should just add that everyone has their video turned off tonight apart from the panel. And please don't take that personally, nothing to do with you. It's for copyright and data protection reasons, because we're recording this event, which is going out live on Twitter and YouTube as well as on Zoom. So welcome to everyone who's joining us that way. Before introducing and hearing from our speakers this evening, I'll just say something very briefly about the book and about our theme for tonight. Scotland After the Virus has 3 strands to it, I suppose, and the first one is visual, as it rises from the cover, which is a set of images produced by artist and weaver James Donald, who used photography to bring people together, to kind of try and lift our spirits, and to raise money also for NHS charities during lockdown. And you'll find the story at the beginning of the book. A second strand is some fabulous short stories collected in the first section, featuring some very fine writers, some well-known, some perhaps a little less known to people. They include Kirstin Innes of Scabby Queen fame, of course, but also some newly commissioned poems which appear throughout the book. So this is not just a book of analysis, it's also a book, you know, very much to revive the human spirit, you know, through everything we've been going through together. But third, there is, of course, commentary on the big public issues: health, media, equality, sport, economy, Scotland's possible future, and indeed the themes for this evening: psychology and spirituality and human values. And so I guess the idea was to bring politics and social issues into direct contact with human values and the needs that we have as we face COVID and hopefully its aftermath together. I think we're very aware, Jerry and I, in putting the book together, that the challenge of COVID-19 opens up huge opportunities to change society for the better. But on the other hand, it's also perhaps a place where we could get stuck if we don't have some resources or don't develop some resources to help us move forward and make that possible, personally and interpersonally, as well as politically and culturally. And so the aim of this evening is to look at different aspects of spirituality and psychology and belief. Both religious and non-religious will be coming this evening from very different backgrounds, and that's great. We want us to find some common ground together. So I suppose it's about how we can be part of a larger story in Scotland and well beyond, about human connection and about transformation. How do we sustain human flourishing in and beyond this pandemic? And can we nurture a fresh culture of life in the face of existential threats to people and planet: climate change, the pandemic and our distorted relationship with the animal kingdom, inequality, poverty, war, all of those kind of huge questions. And obviously we're not going to solve all those tonight, but we hope what we'll do is to open some windows which will be of value to all of us. And I should also add therefore, that this evening is being co-sponsored by the Belief, Ethics and Politics think tank Ecclesia, which I'm the director of, and at the end I'll briefly mention a project which follows on from tonight's topic if you want to continue to follow up some of the themes that we discuss. But in the meantime, that's more than enough from me. We've got a great panel to scale the issues of spirituality and psychology and human values, humanly and intellectually. So let me introduce them with no further ado. And the first of our speakers is going to be Alistair McIntosh. And Alistair is a writer, an academic, an activist with interests that include land reform, community ownership, action on climate justice. And he's also author of the book Riders on the Storm, The Climate Crisis and the Survival of Being, which is not actually published by Luath Press, but they let us plug it this evening. But you'll be buying lots of Luath Press books anyway, so that's terrific. Then our second speaker is going to be Catherine Shea. Catherine is a near neighbour of mine in Leith, and she's a psychotherapist, and she's an accredited cognitive analytic therapist with specialist training in trauma work. And she also contributed a great chapter to this book, as did Alistair, and as did our third speaker, who is Alison Phipps. And Alison is the UNESCO Chair in Refugee Integration through Languages and the Arts at the University of Glasgow, and she's also an amazing activist for refugee rights and for social justice and much else beside. And last but definitely not least, my good friend and colleague Jerry Hassan is a writer and a commentator, research fellow in contemporary history at Dundee University, and he's also the co-editor with me of Scotland After the Virus. So those are our four speakers. They'll be making comments for 5 or 6 minutes each. Then, probably after a bit of panel discussion, we'll move into question and answer. So a good chunk of the evening will be question and answer, your chance to make your points or to ask your questions. And I'm sure we're going to have a great discussion. And first of all, we're looking forward to hearing from Alistair. So over to you, Alistair.
Thank you, Simon, and thank you to the wonderful Luath Press for putting this event on tonight and for publishing this book. When the pandemic started to break and we started to realize it really was a thing, I was finishing off Riders in the Storm. I see that they've sent you one with the new cover on it for the second print run, same contents inside, but a different cover. I've not seen that one yet, Simon, so you're ahead of me there. But I was working on that book, and part of what I was wrestling with, quite a large part of it, was climate change denial and the psychology behind that. The psychology of people who the research suggests are often comfortably well off. They don't want to have their affluence disturbed. And so in terms of cognitive dissonance, the idea that we have to try to keep aligned our set of beliefs and values and what we think is happening in the outside world, in climate change was a huge force to deny that it was really happening. And in the past decade, we've seen, first of all, the climate change deniers saying that it wasn't happening, that the world wasn't warming up. And as the evidence became more and more irrefutable and literally started burning down and flooding people's homes and what have you amongst our neighbors, not just far away, they've changed their rhetoric to saying, well, it's too expensive to do anything about it now. And so they keep shifting to try and deny things. What fascinated and disturbed me when I saw the pandemic breaking out, especially with Trump still at the helm in America, was the way in which that exact same psychology started to kick in. And it was very disturbing. We had a neighbor come to the house about something in the earlier stages of the pandemic. We had seen him going around Govan wearing a mask initially, but he came to our house for something without wearing the mask. And we said to him, where's your mask? What's up? And he says, oh, the pandemic's over. It was a bioweapon concocted by the Americans and the Chinese, and it has now expired. So there's no worry. I mean, I'm talking here about 9 months ago, something like that. We had, in a local charitable organization that I'm involved with, we had people who it didn't feel safe to have them coming into the office in the early stages for the same reason, that they were spreading the conspiracy theories, that it had been hatched up by Dr. Fauci and Bill Gates. This was all part of the deep state control of us. And what I saw going on there was people with not a great deal of sense of agency in their lives, being extremely vulnerable to these things going out on YouTube and Facebook and all the rest of it, and basically being taken advantage of, so that the same kind of people with the same kind of psychology that pushed climate change denial could now push COVID denial with Donald Trump and other similar types of political figure leading him on. In parallel to that, I watched carefully what was happening as the world slowed down, as the pause started to kick in. Because one of the other concerns I'd had with writing about climate change was that I don't think most people, including most environmental activists, realize just what massive change is called for in order to stop this dangerous warming of our planet. We need to move to net zero carbon dioxide emissions. The world is committed to that by 2050. However, during 2020, while COVID was at its peak, the figures are still coming in and being analyzed, but the consensus, generally speaking, is that CO2 emissions, carbon dioxide emissions, fell by only about 7% worldwide. Already there is huge pressure to re-stimulate the automobile industry, etc. We saw just this past week, China raising to a 3-child policy instead of a 2-child policy. It's kind of like everything is go, 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 push, 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 because we need that, or people believe we need that continually escalating economic activity in order to maintain us in our present standards of comfort. And so it was that during 2020, world carbon dioxide levels rose from 412 parts per million to 414, in spite of all the slowdown we've seen. And where this leaves me, Simon and friends, including those I can't see on my screen just now, but it's lovely to know that you are there. Where this leaves me is asking, what does it say about our humanity? Are we going to hunker down, batten hatches, keep the vaccines to ourselves, hope that it just goes away and we don't have to learn anything from it? Or can this be a basic call to consciousness? Can we use what is happening with COVID to wake us up to wider world issues, not least environmental issues, not least climate change, with COP26, the United Nations conference, coming here to Glasgow in November? Can this be a call to our awakening? And that is where in my view, the agenda becomes spiritual. By the spiritual, I mean the innermost parts of our lives, the deepest part of what it means to be a human being, and the levels at which we are no longer separate individuals, but we are profoundly connected as members one of another, as all Buddha nature, as all Muslims are part of the Ummah, as one body, however you want to put it, whatever your perspective might be on that. That profound interconnection was love at the basis of it. And so the question where I would want to leave it is, what can this call forward in terms of our love for one another? Are we going to retreat back into separate selfishness and try, probably in vain, to pull up a drawbridge on the rest of the world, whether it is microorganisms or whether it is refugees fleeing climate change in the future, or indeed the poor, those who are suffering, those who don't have cars or gardens to get out into and have been banged up in high-rise flats during the pandemic? Are we going to pull up the drawbridge on people who lack agency like that? Or are we going to use this as a call to deepen our humanity?
Thank you very much indeed, Alistair, both for setting out the challenge we face, but also the opportunity for interconnectedness and the challenge that that poses to us in human terms as well. Very powerful indeed. Looking forward next to hear from Catherine Shea. Catherine has a chapter in the book on mental health and well-being and the psychological challenge of COVID-19. And I should add, of course, that Alistair and Alison, who you'll hear from a minute, and myself also had a conversation about spirituality that's part of the book. So you can read that as well and follow up on those. But next, we're looking forward to hearing from Catherine.
Thank you, Simon, and thank you, Alistair. I've slightly changed what I want to say because you've both focused things for me. Just in the fact that you, Simon, were talking about how do we sustain the flourishing of our human society, and I think I want to look at how psychological services can better contribute to the flourishing of human society, how we can not just mirror the political social nature of our structures, but also challenge them and invite them to change. And I think Alistair's focus on relationship is key to how I see that happening. The things, your question was what got us through lockdown, and for me that was reading stories. I think I see literature as a better preparation for psychotherapy work than anything, because you're constantly extending the tent poles of your understanding into other worlds and other people, never in a position to patronize or come up with solutions for them, but just getting alongside them and understanding those worlds more. So that capacity to listen respectfully to what's going on for other people just seems to be key, not only to a relational psychotherapy, but also more broadly to human relating. I think oh, sorry, I'm just a bit distracted by something that's come up on screen. I think the other thing that supported me was taking part in a community of reflexivity. Lots and lots of therapy professionals, particularly those who practice cognitive analytic therapy, were getting together in all sorts of structures. And as their services kind of didn't crumple exactly, but they were deeply affected by the strains they were put under, that it seemed that people were willing to come together and talk and reflect on the nature of their services, their strengths and weaknesses, but also the political nature of what they were being asked to provide, in a world where patients are seen as units of work, like seeing a patient as a unit of work. There's something very depersonalizing about a world in which NHS services require targets to be met, and these are people. And if you're doing relational work with them, that can take as long as it takes. So I think one of the things I want to emphasize tonight is the role of relatedness and relationship, and how much psychotherapy might have to offer. I wanted to start with Martin Buber, who said in the beginning was the relation, not least because last week I heard this taken further, when a lecturer who was talking about cognitive analytic therapy was saying in the beginning was the person, and in the beginning was the relation, and in perpetuity is the relation. So forever and forever and forever, as we live on this earth, we are in relationship, but also in the beginning was the relation, and in perpetuity is the relation, and social context. I think too many therapies operate slightly blindly to the social context that they're working within, and in that way they can dangerously reinforce aspects of society that are not particularly helpful. I was reflecting on Freudian analysis and how the way the personality is structured in that, with the superego, which is rational, left brain, and actually quite male, is seen to rule over the id, and the id concludes the animal instincts, as Freud would have called them, and these are women, children, people of colour, and the natural world. So you've got a structure in the person that is trying to overcome and manage and colonize. Well, half the world is trying to colonize the other half, and it's amazing how pervasive that is, because even now, even in our times, we still have movements: Black Lives Matter, Me Too, Extinction Rebellion, inquiries into historic sexual abuse, and looked after children in care, all of which reveal that all those categories which were seen as lesser and have had to be managed have still been subject to abuse in our society. And yet in Victorian times, psychoanalysis was used to reinforce that. And that lesson comes closer to home, because in New Labour, cognitive behavioural therapy became very popular. And I'm not maligning cognitive behavioural therapy, because it's gone through all sorts of changes and more nuanced manifestations. But in the beginning, it was part of Richard Harland's The Happiness Project, and it was brought in when Tony Blair brought in the New Deal, which left a lot of people unemployed. And the idea was that CBT would be given to unemployed people to help them come to terms with their unemployment, their situation, by seeing it as a result of the way they were thinking about it. So it was very much adopting that line from Hamlet: there is nothing good or bad, but thinking makes it so. And the role of therapy at that point was to help people think themselves okay about being poor and having insecure housing, and obviously that's a pretty appalling use of psychotherapy services. So would like to advocate for a model of relational working that's also much more aware about of the context of the society that we are living in, and how dangerously we can become co-opted to deliver services that are required by the government, when what I would like to see is the problems that we are seeing in the room, that we're given time to work with them without trespassing on the people that we're working with, or forcing them to adopt solutions that don't really suit them, but which suit capital, which suit the available resources. Actually us being able to feed back to government about what we're seeing in the rooms where we work, and ask for more societal consciousness about what people are suffering. I think that was a really important thing about COVID. COVID's been really helpful, because it has exposed the unfairness in our society, and it has revealed, as you were saying, people who have no gardens, what do they do? People who can't get out of their flats. It's revealed the injustice. But it's one thing to reveal it, and it's quite another to know what to do about it. We applaud ACEs. ACEs are very popular. Adverse childhood experiences are very popular in all sorts of therapeutic settings. But what's not acknowledged is that it often requires relational work to repair adverse childhood experiences, because they occur in relationship and they affect the development of a person. So it's only when you recapitulate those developmental stages with somebody in therapy that they're able to recover. And this takes time, and it can't be economically driven. Whereas we're still getting short-term therapies being marketed. And the final point I would like to make is that rather than what's happening in the current therapeutic culture is that there's a proliferation of more and more models. It kind of fits with a consumer model, the latest new acronym, with shiny booted and suited people coming up from England to delivering what appears to be a short-term training. It's going to be really cost effective. It actually costs an arm and a leg. People do a 2-day training and they're then sent out to deliver this therapy. And it's all, as I say, it's new and shiny. It's got a new acronym, but it's not rooted in anything. And the same thing could have been provided at home. But there's something about the pervasive neoliberal mindset that thinks the latest shiny new thing has to be the best, or they take bits of things and parcel them offer them separately rather than taking a whole integrated package of psychotherapy. So just as I would like to see relational work, I would also like to see time and care given to the kind of psychotherapy that is integrated and integrates all aspects of the person. Yeah, rather than like taking a bit of a psychotherapy like mentalization and applying it to this group of people when actually they need the whole deal. Thank you. Anyway, I'll stop there and save all my screens of paper for questions in case there are any questions.
Thank you very much indeed, Catherine. That's an amazing tour de force in a few minutes, both the psychological and mental health services and trends in it, but also kind of reminding us that it is true at the same time that the personal is political, but also that the political needs to be rendered personal, and there are all kinds of structural reasons why that doesn't happen, and those are the challenges we need to face. Thank you so much for that.
If I could add to that, Simon, there was a wonderful quotation about how therapists are allowed to do their job properly. They can become incubators of democracy. I thought that was absolutely wonderful, that if we can work properly with people, we can enable them to be empowered citizens, and then the whole of society will be helped to flourish through that, not just because they're better, as it were, but also because of what they can do.
The conversation in itself, I'm sure that's fantastic. So let me now hand over to Alison Phipps. I hope Alison will forgive me for saying that in my mind she's a prime example of what Gramsci called an organic intellectual. She's someone working with an academic institution, but she's also on the street. She's also working, lobbying, acting for change, and bringing considerable intellectual resources to that task. So fantastic. Looking forward to hearing from you, Alison.
Thanks, Simon. That's extremely kind of you. I'm actually going to start with Simon's question, which he asked us, which really got me thinking, and over the weekend particularly, where he said, what's got you and others through the pandemic so far on a personal and relational level? And I just kind of I was out on my allotment, for which I pay £37.50 a year in rent, and if I can't afford it, someone else will pay it for me, and I've had it for 20 years now. And it's a microcosm of society. It's full of people who, to my mind, are absolutely crazy and absolutely wonderful, and every possible nuance and shade in between. But everybody united in a certain distrust of and despair of the power of slugs. Slugs too, which have at times for me through my life become metaphors for those things that I'm struggling against. The UK Home Office would be pretty much central amongst that at the moment, but many other agents of the forces of evil that are hell-bent on ensuring that all will not flourish. And on Sunday, I was up on the plot and I was transplanting my beans, which were already looking like we'd had a really bad May. And the kind of edges of them were already looking a bit nibbled, and like they were already going to be suffering from whatever pathogen or virus was going to be in the air. And I was thinking about Jerry and Simon, your wonderful work in Scotland after the virus, and was just thinking, I feel utterly defeated because my beans have got blackened edges and I'm going to have to plant them out again. And why have my beans got blackened edges? Well, because my normal source of seeds dried up. So I've had to go elsewhere, and I've had to depend on things I don't rightly understand. And I can't get the normal amount of manure or chicken shit that will actually be the stuff I can put and add to the soil to actually begin to create an environment that will be full, forgive me, of so much crap that something can rot and something can change. So I was sitting there with my friend Chaz's words in my head. My friend Chaz is a Tuhoe Maori bushman who has committed himself to the work of decolonizing the mind and especially the spirit, and has been one of the leading activists in Aotearoa, New Zealand, in land reform. Not just land reform on a legal level, but on a profound spiritual level of saying the land is not ours. We do not own the land. The land does not belong to us. It is not ours to take what we would from it. The land is a mother, is a womb, is a space, is a place where we learn love, where we learn language, where we learn the power of a spiritual connection to the more than human world. And he would regularly quote a reference to me. Whenever he came across when we were walking in the woods, he would say, "Ah, look, there is another great tree that has fallen in the forest." And this was a metaphor for the great elders of Tuhoi Mari tribes who had passed, but it was also the actual tree covered in fungus. And he would say regularly to me, "Alison, remember this, remember only this, no matter what, the fungus will fix everything." So I'm sitting on the plot and my beans have got whatever it is they've got. They're already being attacked. The slugs are on the march. The frog spawn hasn't quite done what it normally does in my little pond this year. There aren't quite as many frogs hopping around to do their work with the slugs. And then I trip over and I re-sprain the ankle that's been a dicky ankle for years, ever since I first did it on Kinder Scout. And my brother, who's in the mountain rescue, who was with me, decided that this was a cause of mirth and celebration that his sister was rolling around in agony, until he actually realized that this was for real. So I'm sitting there in pain, and my beans are in pain, and my soil is feeling thin, and my £37.50 feels like it might not be the solace that it has obviously been all year, because what's kept me going has been having some earth that I rent in the spirit of what crofting offers to people, and what before the great enclosures was offered to people right across the United Kingdom, where we had land that we tilled and held in common. I'm beginning to feel defeated by my one source of solace too, because I can't go swimming, and my house isn't a safe place at present because of the care work I've been having to do for the last 9 months under lockdown. And my work is not a place of solace, as it often is, because the UK government has cut 70% of the 24 million of aid projects that I've been working with across 20 countries overseas. If you have a Conservative MP out there and you feel at all strongly about the aid cuts, please just drop them an email this week and encourage them to vote with the rebels. So I'm sitting here thinking, no matter what, the fungus will fix everything. No matter what, time will take its toll, and that the virus, the pathogen, is here as much to help us understand what fixing everything might mean in a far more global and post-human sense of time, a sense of time that might be much more cyclical than linear, a sense of time that might take us outside of Gantt charts and linear project management sheets that tell everybody what the milestones are that they will reach by a certain date or be for the chop. But actually, no matter what, maybe the fact that I've had to sit with my feet up for the last few days, maybe the fact that I've had to slow things down and actually admit the full scale of the defeat of the work that I've been engaged in for a very long time. Maybe that's part of actually letting the fungus fix everything, actually letting defeat be part of a spirituality of care. Because without an acceptance that I can't fix everything, that I need the fungus, that I need others, that I need to acknowledge my vulnerability, that I in my own strength am as nothing, then there will be no fixing of anything. Because I need my neighbours next door to pop round with some salt. And because I have needed, in a time where hospitality as a rite, as a ritual, as a spiritual duty of all humankind has been denied us across the globe. And I don't just mean the hospitality industry of folk getting on jets to go and have a nice holiday if they can afford it, but I mean the deep rituals of hospitality whereby we embrace a gift economy, whereby a plate will be brought round by one person with food on it, with a plate on top of it, as my African friends tell me the story. And what you do is, when you've finished your food and you've put what's left over in the compost bin so the fungus can fix everything, you return that plate with something else on it. You let a gift economy be part of a cycle of life and death and life and death and life and death. We're just beginning to realize that our rituals of death, our rituals of mourning, our understanding of what life might be, which has been fully wedded to an idol of life without death, a belief that death is the worst thing that can happen to us, when I know for a fact from bitter experience and for the experience of many of those in my family and within my wider kith and refugee kin, this is not true. That the living hell that is Tigray and the genocide and the level 5 experiment look like. How do we admit defeat and still every fantastic survivalship? Everybody have the time to say, as we all say, I'm not coping at the moment. I'm not surviving this pandemic. I'm not even close to getting through. I'm going to need time to rest. I'm going to need what Corinne Polwart speaks about in her absolutely astonishing one-woman play, Wind Resistance, where she speaks of the skein of the wild geese, and that in that skein of the wild geese, there is a real beauty about wind resistance for us to learn, that we have to learn again the lessons of wind resistance, because if we don't, if we try and do it on our own, we won't allow ourselves the possibility of letting there be a space to rest and mend again and again. The skein of the wild geese, she says, means that each geese will take a turn. Each of the geese will step up and take the burden and take the brunt and then step back. And that is part of a metaphor, she says, for the way we might get through this, for how we might labour and rest and mend. And so she has a lovely refrain in Wind Resistance that is going through my mind at the moment, where she says, every goose takes a turn, stepping up, falling back, labouring and resting, stepping up, falling back, labouring and resting. It's a gorgeous symbiotic dance of rest to those who are strong.
It really, when talking to somebody this spirituality and self and just demonstrating life, it's about okay.
Thank you, Simon. Thank you, everyone. I'm not sure how I'm going to follow those three fantastic, rich, nuanced, and poetic contributions. I'm going to open with and public life. Something that's always been at the back of my head is a quote from Chesterton, when Chesterton said, and apologies for the gendered language here, is of that age, when a man stops believing in God, he doesn't stop believing in something, he believes in anything. And across my whole of my arc of my political public life, I've thought I've more and more, as I think, to put it pejoratively, people search for and want practically false meaning, rather than accepting there might not sometimes be meaning. I've seen that. What got me through lockdown? Well, living with a dog for the first time, big thing. Then getting, in the last 5 weeks, a Romanian street dog, and learning that I see the whole city I live in a completely different take. I see the best of it. The fact that all these people speak to you about things, about really interesting things, deep stuff. And at the same time, my view of the lack of care in this city, of the debris, of the litter, of the chaos of nights before, I am seeing all of that in detail every day. So the best and the worst. But I've also enjoyed the silence of the last year. I really like silence. There was a bit of an abeyance of noise, the fact that the aircraft weren't in the air so much. And the fact there was new voices on a whole host of things and stories. I thought that particularly in an area I'm passionate about, music. The fact that the corporate Leviathan became a bit slower, at least a bit slower. Didn't obviously go completely. But while in the last year, the loss and the hurt and the grief and the lack of acknowledgement of that in public, and obviously Britain's humongous failure at the level of UK government, and how that is not recognised somehow. Along with that, and feeling, what can one do? I felt the pause and the change of tempo welcome, like a lot of people. But it then brings me back to, the balance between meaning and not meaning. And I think, to be fair, and I think people probably touched on it, and Alistair particularly, we are going to see restoration. We are going to see the economic determinist paradigm just like go into overdrive. We are going to have catch up. We are going to even have catch up at the individual level of people feeling, I had my consumption denied, my flights to various holidays, etc. And I think from a lot of that, I think all the mainstream political philosophies are exhausted and hollowed out and discredited, and that is as true in Scotland as elsewhere. And I'd just like to pose a couple of quick thoughts. And I think a couple of comments have draw from this, because we all do, is that in too much of radical politics, there is what I would call a left miserablest tradition that believes that by saying how bad things have been in the last 40 years or how bad things are now, that there is somehow a redemption and then a liberation through that. And I personally think it's entirely the wrong way to think about things, because if you say, as I have heard at events, people actually say, yes, everything in the world that has happened in the last 40 years has been wrong, broken, going in the wrong direction. You don't then suddenly say, yes, I agree to sign up to your revolutionary political project. Please, here's my money. You diminish people's capacity. It's damning, and it's also completely inaccurate. Just the fall of the Berlin Wall, the fall of apartheid, the fact that, certainly in the last 50 years, 60 years, the last fascist dictatorships left Europe. The rise of environmentalism, Black Lives Matter, etc., etc. You don't get anywhere by that. And there's that uber version of it, but in all, I think, left politics, trying to deal with neoliberalism, capitalism, the crisis of the planet, and how we understand it as human beings, I think it's there. I wonder about how we make sense. Catherine mentioned this about the sense of story and allowing for different stories. It's also true, bad people tell stories. When I ventured into the story area in various projects, I then realized that, bad people tell compelling stories. The Nazis told one of the greatest stories of humanity in its evil, Trump, populism, etc. And how do we find a collective joy that avoids kind of left miserableism? I don't know. What I do know in Scotland, taking it back to here, is being aware of the missing voices in a politics that's meant to be inclusive, and being aware of, again, I think Catherine alluded to this, about relational space, who's in the conversation and who's not, because apart from our indie ref, our public life just basically grinds over people and doesn't really acknowledge the people who don't have, doesn't acknowledge at all the people who don't have power. So my final thought here is really, I just want to take it back to someone who has been enormously influential on me in the last decade and on lots of people, and that's the late Mark Fisher, who really tried to come to terms with the capitalism we live in and search for an agency. And he said, we need to learn or relearn how to build comradeship and solidarity instead of doing capital's work for it by condemning and abusing each other. If we could even just stop the latter part, it would be a beginning. If we could have the space and the generosity to do that, that would be a start, because the challenges we're going to face, and I'm sure we'll get into some of this, are going to be even more immense than the challenges of the last 40 years that have had some good, but an awful lot of bad. So I'll leave that there. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Jerry, and really good to end also on that kind of invitational note as to how we can move forward. There are some fantastic comments in chat, and I'll try and pick some of those up and invite people into the conversation in a moment. But I wondered if there was anything that anyone on the panel wanted to say or ask of the others, or comment on what others had said before we get into that. Was there anything that you were burning to add? They're all being very modest at this point. No, that's fine.
If I could just pick up on Jerry's focus on negativity there, and I wonder, how much what we see going on in the world today is due to a collapse of gratitude, that we no longer complete the cycles of grace. it's said that a gift must always flow. If you hold on to a gift, if you possess it and don't let it pass on, it turns toxic. And when you look at the dynamics with the vaccine, with the whole anti-vax dynamic that is going on, I wonder how much it's because we've all had it so good and we've just absorbed that good. We've wanted more and more good, but we have failed too often to return something to the wider system. And that then poisons even what we've got.
Yeah, that's a very strong and powerful question. There are other, just to pick up on what's happening in chat, I think most people can probably see that. But just to mention that Craig Lundy raised the question of keeping the vaccine to ourselves, which a number of you mentioned. I don't think most people are happy, he says, being selfish, but we're alienated from the democratic process that could be extended to allow our love to connect more and give us confidence in each other and overcome the narrative that selfishness is inevitable. And again, that links back to what, in different ways, both Jerry and Alison were saying, and Alistair has been engaging with Craig on those issues. But just to say, in a moment, I'm going to ask Angela Lombardi and Colin McCormack if they want to ask their questions in person. But I will put Craig's to you, Catherine, because Craig has also said, I'm interested in the way that we do that, how we move away from selfishness. Religion may never recover the local universality it once had, but we can maybe bring back some of the equality and democratic voice implied by the best of religion. That's an interesting question to which we might return. But he says, I wonder also how Catherine would respond to a comparison between herself and traditional pastors who help people to become healed and able to heal others. You got on that, Catherine?
Yes, that's a very interesting question. Because I did feel at one point there was a really strong thought about the parallels between church and state and psychotherapy and state, and I do think I don't know whether I've experienced pastors healing me so that I could heal others. I do think psychotherapy aims to do that, and I'm not quite sure what I'm torn between seeing what Alistair was saying about our selfishness and seeing that in anti-vaxxers. I just watched the Channel 4 documentary about that and the strong hold that lies can have on people and how obsessed they become, and also how obsessive we become about our well-being and how hard it is to make people let go of that. For the greater good, but I do also in working with people on a one-to-one basis, I tend to find that people are basically good and that their selfishness is a result of developmental failures and also the prevailing culture around them. So it's a really interesting question, because obviously that sounds quite idealist, and it's almost as if everyone could be have a good one-to-one relationship and explore where they were coming from with somebody, the world will be a better place. Now, obviously, I don't think it's as simple as that. But yes, it was. I can't remember now what the quotation was about the parallel with the church, and I do think a lot of the time psychotherapists have been seen as the new priesthood, as it were. It's quite a common trope in writing about psychotherapy. And the original word therapein in Greek meant attending in the temple, but you were attending to people as they came to the temple with the aim of healing them. So I think what Craig's asking is going right to the heart of something of what the job is meant to be about.
Yeah, I mean, thanks very much for that. And I mean, obviously, well, I run a think tank which looks at issues of religion, and I have to say the R word was one that we decided to sort of keep out of this because it can, particularly at the moment, put an awful lot of people off. But certainly one of the ways Ecclesia approaches is to note the ways in which different religions, and I think it's helpful to talk about plural rather than singular here. An atheistic Buddhist has very little, if anything, in connection, let's say, with a right-wing televangelist in the States, but they're both described as religious, which shows that the language is evacuated of meaning. But certainly it's an area of contestation in which you have very imperial and dominant and hierarchical and patriarchal forms, and you also have liberative and subversive
Totally.
and creative forms,
Totally.
and so on. I mean, Alison was, referring to that particularly.
Yeah.
So these
And
issues are
yeah.
framed in that way. To try and move on and bring other people in, I'm going to bring in Angela if she would like to unmute, and she made an important point in the chat, which she maybe wants to ask as a question, and then I'll come on to Colin, and then I'll come on to Bonnie, just to give you advance warning of that. But Angela, it'd be great to hear from you.
Hello, I only managed to come in at 10 to 8, so I missed Alistair, I think. It's been really great to hear from Catherine and Alison and Jerry. Been really excited about this as a practicing Buddhist in Glasgow. And yes, I suppose what I was thinking was post-pandemic, it feels like many people have come to have had an experience of quiet and stillness and an appreciation of smaller experience. But I wonder how we manage to help people within a capitalist context retain some of that without feeling the grasping pull of that which we are that which the whole purpose of capitalism is to pull us towards that in order to highlight the dissatisfaction level in order that we pay for something that will fill that gap and satisfy
and become consumers, as you said in your comment. Yeah, thanks very much. Who would like to have a chew on that? Alison, I'm kind of looking at you. I think you might have a chew on that one.
Yeah, I love the question, Angela, and I was finding myself going to a knee jerk of, have these really been smaller experiences? Kind of thinking a little bit about, and I think that's kind of what you're getting at as well, about the way that within my tradition we speak about the two books, the book that is the book of scripture and the book that is the great book of creation, and what it means to read and contemplate and meditate with those. And there has been a lot of discussion about people just craving being outside in green spaces, and parks just undergoing an extraordinary renaissance, and as watching these city councils that have said for years, oh no, couldn't possibly put more money into these things, and suddenly are actually looking at changing, really quite dramatically changing the nature of our urban spaces, that will mean that these become different experiences or more accessible for people. And that's not unlike the public health revolutions of the Victorian era, where we went, okay, everyone needs clean running water. So I think there's something there that might come, and it might come with a faster pace of change than we might have seen otherwise, and might not need us to think that COP will be the hook for everything. But my honest feeling is that we're changed by love and relationships, fundamentally changed by love and relationships, and that the world is as big or as small as the amount and the ability we have to love our neighbors as we love ourselves. And that so I've had the extraordinary experience of becoming a grandparent for the second time during lockdown, and just that experience of separation and that desire to be with the grandchildren, and then the ability to be with the grandchildren and to be with my granddaughter, who's jumping up and down in a puddle, shouting, "Abai, Abai, look at me, Peppa Pig, jumping in muddy puddles," and me just feeling like there is just no greater joy than jumping up and down in a muddy puddle with my granddaughter. And this just feels like the greatest of experiences. So something for us about rediscovering joy, the fruits of gratitude, that are part and parcel of the gifts of most of the world's great faith traditions, and that are things that we wish to teach our children, say thank you, say please. There's something there in that basic psychology. Certainly in the West, it's not needed in the same way in many other world cultures because it's already built into a cycle of understanding. This is part of a gift exchange, but we need to kind of re-find it and reinvent it for ourselves. So I think, love and relationships are absolutely at the core of how this happens. And I've just watched even my own terrace just change from, all we did was pop a note through the door and go, hey folks, let's have a WhatsApp group through the pandemic. Yeah, and now it's like, it's like nature watch, as people say, have you seen in the back lane, there's a little, there's a bird's nest, or be careful, or I saw a hedgehog on the street the other day. I mean, it's like spring watch all over again. And so I do think there's something there that is coming from the sharing of joy that then allows the holding of sadness. And certainly, I mean, I'd be right up with what Jerry was saying about, the misery of left-wing politics, and I've lived with it all my life and really never had truck with it. And when I say I'm defeated, I'm not that sad about it, because if that's what's defeating me, then I want none of it. If my God, or whatever you want her to be called, can't cope with my suffering, I may as well forget them and wait for the one who can. This is not going to serve me or anybody else. Whereas, this deep sense of love and exchange and ability to grow and thrive through disappointment, through broken relationship, through all the things that are hard about life, but to still be able to find people who can walk alongside you for a little way and share a meal with you for a little while, that's enough. And Rowan Williams, the former Archbishop of Canterbury, he says, at the end of the day, it's about meeting, greeting, and eating. It boils down to that. Being able to say hello on the streets, being able to share food, being able to, genuinely make a connection. It isn't about being, passionately in love with every single human being, but it is about, there's something about real love also being particular, that we start with one human being, and that might be someone as small as my new grandson, or it might be, somebody as old as the person I'm giving care to at the moment in my home. But, real love is particular. And we learn about the worst of ourselves and the best of ourselves through that. And certainly within my team in the UNESCO chair at the moment, we've really said that our work is to hold the bowl of tears and expand the space for joy.
Great way of putting that.
It's not either.
Yeah, if I can, I'm just looking at the clock. Unfortunately, it's one of my jobs to look at the clock. Talking about trying to avoid commodification, we are stuck within the realm of time. We have 15 minutes left. Right at the end, all of our panelists are going to have a chance to just say one last quick thing, and then we have a couple of notices. I'm going to bring in Alistair for a quick comment. If we can all keep our comments reasonably quick, I can then bring other people in. There are quite a number of comments stacking up, so I want to see what I can do over the next few minutes, if you'll forgive me. Alistair, did you want to make a quick comment on this? You're muted at the moment.
Not on that. I think you can push on.
Okay.
And hear more from the questioners.
Yeah, I'm aware that Alistair's work on land and recovering land is very relevant to this question. I'm aware also that
on that, I mean, the whole agenda of land. I mean, what can we do? Somebody was saying, by way of well-being, somebody in the chat was saying, by way of well-being, what can we do? And I noticed somebody there, Jim, saying, living on an island, it's freed up the solidarity of most people. In fact, Community Land Scotland did a study of that, and they drew out how it was so often, it was the land trusts and the development trusts locally that put in place the support within the community for COVID. So when people have got connection with their place, they've got agency to be able to do these things. They've got legitimacy. They've got the infrastructure to be able to do it. And so in terms of well-being, I think you've basically got low-cost options that just by freeing up what we have got, however that does, and we've talked a lot about love. I was talking about grace and gratitude and so on. As well as those things of the inner nature of our humanness, we also need to look at the political structures.
Right.
We also need to look at what in Scotland can be done to redistribute wealth. For example, using our taxation powers that we've already got, but are frightened to use for fear that people will not then vote for the party that puts them into place. But what is wrong with us if we don't do that?
Yeah.
You know, an extra pack of butter to somebody who's very rich means very little utility. Redistribute it to somebody who's got none, and it's huge value. So you multiply well-being disproportionately.
Mm. And I mean, it's a really important issue because, you know, it seems to me as someone who spends a lot of time dealing with politics and public policy issues, the thing that one is campaigning to change for is to get government and so on to act in such a way both to open up spaces for people to act themselves, democratization, and also to contest the forces of commodification and capital and so on, which are always trying to colonize those kind of spaces. Let me bring in, I'm going to bring in Colin McCormack, who's made a very important point about psychotherapy, mental health services and so on. And then I'm going to invite Bonnie in and so on. And I'll try and scan and see what other things people have been saying while I do that. Colin.
Hi, can you hear me okay? Because I'm
Yes.
using my phone.
Yep.
That's good. Thanks, Jerry, Simon, for the book. My question for that was really good. I think all the connection I love about Ross is really important. I love Alistair with the Green Land is in terms of the land with elders, all that. If you like, my point much in terms of those most at the pandemic. So in my case, like I'm doing managing at Glasgow. So that includes psychotherapy, you know, the trauma service. I know the issues. They're deep, seated, deep rooted. And what I was posing in the question was the fact that I was actually struck during the pandemic about the fact that the First Minister, Nicola Sturgeon, felt able, actually I think is the word, to use the word love in some of her briefings and broadcasts. And yet that kind of language, that kind of thing about the importance of relationships, about being interpersonal, even in mainstream NHS services, is actually not common. It doesn't permeate her policies. It's almost frowned upon, you know, to share your personal experiences with the patient. And I just wonder if we can have some kind of exhortation in policy terms, you know, to really stress the fact that that needs to feature more commonly, that we need to humanise to some extent. Statutory services, I'm as guilty as the rest in terms of I manage the institutions, I manage psychiatric hospitals. It is difficult, but I'm looking for ways where we can introduce that kind of language into the mainstream, because that needs to connect with the people who are most adversely affected, hopefully, as you've all said, post-pandemic. I'll stop there. Sorry, that was a long question.
That's okay, Colin, but thank you. And you made some important points in that. I wonder, you know, briefly whether Jerry and perhaps Catherine want to just say anything briefly in response to that, and then I'll bring Bonnie in.
I can just say that I think I totally really agree with everything you've said there, Colin. I think there's such a difference and a disconnect in Scotland between the official language. It was great when Nicola Sturgeon talked about love. I remember that speech well. The Scottish Government couldn't be more far removed from a practice of that. I mean, it really is, you know, the only way it has a merit in a sense is the fact it's in some way an expression of us. And it's also a bit different from Westminster. We have so far to travel to embody a language of love and empathy and connecting the Scotland we claim. You know, we want to connect because we, our government and us don't do it. And I think maybe we can get onto this later. There's something about, you know, Glasgow's way to have 277 days of restrictions tomorrow and then change. And there's just so much that people have gone through here and elsewhere. And actually, when we go through the change of tomorrow into the prospect for our cities and our public spaces is actually much, much grimmer than what we've already seen. And we need to like recognize that and act and, you know, change it.
Thank you, Jerry. Catherine, was there anything you wanted to add on that question?
Just to emphasise with what was said about the statutory services, because I work in private practice, but most of my colleagues doing cognitive analytic therapy are in statutory services, and they do suffer from a research culture and a psychological culture. Like lots of clinical psychologists don't necessarily do their own personal therapy, so there's not that acquaintance with self-disclosure or being vulnerable. It's like being invulnerable. This is how you have to be quite a lot at the time, and getting alongside people in relationship requires shedding all of that. But I think there's such pressure on NHS services, it's very hard to do that in that context with colleagues, and the people who are doing it feel as if they're doing it in secret and under pressure, particularly as the pandemic has unfolded, and the need has grown greater for that human. One of the things I noticed was that as people started to work online, one of my colleagues said it levels the playing field, because sometimes patients are helping the therapist with their tech, you know, and it was as if all of a sudden there was a permission. So at the same time as it's a difficult picture, I do think there are windows of light, and maybe this has changed the ground a bit, not in the major institutions, but just in individual pieces of work. But I would love to advocate for what's being asked for. I think it's a big issue about how we put that forward and get it accepted.
Thanks very much, Catherine. Just to say before I invite Bonnie in, some other great comments. I'm sorry that we're not going to be able to deal with all of them, but Joseph Mandava asked the question about how to provide substance to the well-being economy. That's a big thing. It's an issue that's dealt with in a number of ways in the book, by the way. Sorry to be plugging the book, but that is part of the aim of the evening. And to remind you that SATV Social is the code that you can put into the Luath Press website in order to get a £2.99 discount from the book. So again, kind of apologies for commodifying, as we're trying to be anti-commodification here, but hopefully the book does bring together things in a valuable way. Claire Donaldson's also made some great comments about children and about nature. Hope people can pick those up from the chat. But let me bring Bonnie Evans-Hills in here, and I should say Bonnie does a huge amount of work on refugee campaigning and issues, and is a good friend of Ecclesia, and we haven't spoken before, so I'm just delighted to hear her voice.
Oh, that's really kind. It's really exciting to be here, and good for plugging the book. I was really struck by the comments from Jerry Hassan, well, all of the speakers, but particularly about the use of miserabilization of our politics. I mean, and it reminded me, you know, back in the first Trump-Hillary Clinton election, and then also with the Brexit vote, and more recently the elections in the UK, is that the agenda was set by, I would call them right-wing politics. And there was no real challenge to that. It was like the agenda was set, and okay, we're gonna work on this. And it was all about setting up difference and fear and who it is to be afraid of. And I was reminded of, there's a book called Happy Cities that's based on the World Happiness Index. And it showed that those places in the world that are considered to be happier, it didn't matter how wealthy or how poor those particular nations or cities were. What mattered was the equality of access to housing, education, employment, healthcare, without othering any particular group, whether it's race or gender or sexuality or refugees or whatever. You know, that equality of access was there. Introduce an othering, and then you introduce fear, and people, that also introduces a kind of disquiet and unhappiness. And you give people an opportunity to find a way through the hate and reach across and develop friendships. And I think people really jump at it. I mean, in my experience in different places in the world, that's it. You offer them a way to love, as was mentioned, and they will jump at it. I mean, and especially, you know, recently the events in Glasgow with a whole community coming together and refusing to allow immigration services to take two people away, and saying, oh no, they're Glaswegians, they belong to us, they're our neighbor. So yeah, I'm just really identified with all of that. But thank you to all of the speakers.
Thank you very much, Bonnie. And those are great questions to have at the end. And it's a good segue to say to each of our speakers, in the order that they started, have you got a last comment that you want to make about anything really? But it will need to be reasonably brief, because we need to wrap up in a couple of minutes. Alistair, start with you. I think you need to unmute.
I would just say to what we've just heard, I would quote my colleague Jehan MacLeod, the co-founder of the Galgale Trust here in Govan. And she said, let's have a secret agenda to make love the most popular 4-letter word in Scotland.
That's a great one. Thanks very much, Alistair. Catherine.
I can't match that. That is just great. But it actually goes to the heart of what I wanted to say, because I had at the back of my mind thinking about this whole presentation that part of my formation was in, the exodus from Egypt, leaving captivity, and I have an idealistic streak that wants to get to the promised land, but of course it's not like that. The promised land is also full of nettles and whatever and slugs and however. So there's something about needing the idealism to carry us forward, but actually it's the simplicity that Alison referred to, the love of my local community and the love of the people I've been working with, and the vulnerability and the sharing, that it's on that small level, that grassroots level, that I find the greatest hope.
Thank you very much indeed. That's terrific. Alison, do you have an epigram for us?
I can give you one from Jericho Brown, who's one of my favourite poets at the moment. And he said, if you are really good at hurting Black people, you will indeed be hurting the environment, I promise you. And if you're really good at hurting women, you're probably really interested in war. And I just constantly come back to the need for us to study war no more, for us to actually genuinely make the new world right now, not to preach about it, not to lecture about it, not to critique it. My colleague Boaventura de Sousa Santos, whose name I love saying, in Epistemologies of the South, talks about the fact that the cognitive empire is over, that we need books absolutely like yours, like Scotland After the Virus, that are poetry and art and story, and that allow people a way in, but also invite everybody in to make the new world together. Aware that in the old Māori proverb, ka whai tono mato, which means it will be a struggle without end forever and ever and ever, but a beautiful struggle it will be.
Thank you. Jerry.
Right. Well, I can't match that again, but I would just like to close this kind of observation from the local to the universal briefly, is that 277 days after Glasgow has endured the restrictions, is really what we need to challenge is the official future of the city, Scotland and the world. And it's absolutely intrinsic to what Bonnie just said, in that what we often don't understand, those of us that think of ourselves as on the left, is that neoliberalism has an explicit but also false sense of positivity in it. In the last 40 years, when people have been going about, look at all the things we're losing, neoliberals have posed, if we all just accept the market, the sovereign self, etc., we will be better as a world, bigger, better, etc. But it has a conceit in it because it is a linear optimism about the version of tomorrow is just a bigger version of today. So the official future, you have to name it, you have to challenge it, and we have to defeat it. And we can only defeat it not with a miserableism, but with a genuine sense of kind of happiness and solidarity and love. We never will defeat it through miserableism.
Thank you very much, Jerry. That's a fantastic note to end on, and to enable me to say two things to end with. The first is just to say I'm really sorry for those that I couldn't bring into the conversation in chat, but we are saving chat, and Ecclesia is going to be running a project encouraging people to share their own experiences of living with the pandemic and living beyond it, and picking up on the kind of issues we've been talking about tonight. If any of you want to contribute to that, the website is www.ecclesia.co.uk, and you'll find under contacts you can drop a note via a form, and if you're interested in writing or sharing as part of that project, you would be very welcome. The second thing I need to say is a massive thank you to Alistair and Alison and Catherine and Jerry for a really stimulating evening. We've covered a lot of ground in a short space, and that's been terrific. But thank you also to everyone who's been listening, who's contributed to the chat, and thank you especially to Luath Press for hosting this. They've left the details in the chat and will email you later about getting hold of the book. But a big thank you for a really stimulating evening, and have a great rest of the evening, folks. Thank you.